The focus of this lecture is to explore the ideas of the Reformation and what happens at the Reformation. So we've moved through the patristic period into the medieval period, and then something happens in the 1500s that causes this Reformation and this splintering of Christianity. And so we want to talk about some of the conditions of belief that form and shape this and look at some of the people that are an important part of it. Now, it's important to understand that before Luther and Calvin, there are already impulses of reform. So, we've already kind of talked about the iconoclastic controversy, we talked about the Eucharistic controversy, so that's way back in the 800s, 900s. And then you get the split in 1054 of the East and West. And here you also find, before the Reformation, kind of different figures that are at work. So John Wycliffe is someone in England who's translating the Bible into the vernacular or the common language, English. He's challenging the authority of tradition. He's questioning the Catholic Church's emphasis on transubstantiation and how they understand the presence of Christ in the bread and the wine. And then you get a guy named John Huss, who is burned at the stake in 1415 for arguing similar things about vernacular and questioning the authority of the church. And then you get different groups like the Waldensians in France and Bohemian Brethren. They're groups that begin to kind of focus on what eventually will be uh, the church and the community and the priesthood of all believers. And so you get the Brethren of the Common Life. They focus on study, meditation. One of the other key focuses here, I think, is to recognize in the medieval period this hierarchy of spiritual above material. So the work of the priests and the church is more important than, being a plumber or a farmer or whatever. That's going to change, and you begin to see these kind of impulses emphasize that. And you get a focus on ministry reaching out into the community and working in the community and preaching rather than this monastic solitude. You also get a guy named Erasmus in the Catholic Church, who is a humanist, which means that he wants to return to kind of the Greco-Roman sources, and he's advocating for a reform in the church. I mean, the Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation, most people would agree that there were reforms that needed to be made, and Erasmus is one of them. Now, when we talk about humanism, it's important to recognize there's a renaissance taking place. There's this discovery of all of these different texts and learning and things like that. The printing press and so on. And so Erasmus shares a lot in common with Luther and Calvin, for example, and going back to the kind of these sources and wanting to reform. He also is advocating for a form of asceticism that's focused on Christian living. And again, Calvin is going to focus on that. Part of the kind of Dutch Reformed even focus on piety and so on that comes out of the Calvinism is monastic in the sense of a form of asceticism. And he's very Christocentric and wants to see and focus on philosophy and interpreting things in Christ and this notion of all truth is God's truth. So there's this focus in Erasmus on learning and education and so on. Now, the difference between Erasmus and Luther and Calvin is that Erasmus remains a Catholic. He's critical of the church and he calls for reform, but he stays, and he eventually does kind of take on Luther to a certain extent. And then you get, of course, Martin Luther. Now, it's important to recognize Luther is not wanting to leave the church, but Luther is calling for reforms, and he is going to push back against kind of the penitential system that emphasizes indulgences and this idea that you could give an offering or something that would affect your loved ones in purgatory. And it's not that Luther was opposed to purgatory early on. What he's opposed to are the abuse of indulgences. He saw that the church was using them to make money, and he saw that as a serious problem. And that's what pushes him into kind of rethinking his theology and emphasizing the reforms that he's going to make. Now, to understand Luther, I think it's important to recognize the difference between a theology of the cross and a theology of glory. So, a theology of glory wants to focus on the natural ability of humanity to see God in the creation, to use philosophy to begin to kind of construct our towers, so to speak, our scholastic towers. Now, remember Aquinas. Aquinas is saying we can move out into the creation to get to God and understand God and humanity in the context of creation. Now, again, Aquinas believed in faith and grace and revelation, but it was much more this understanding of the human ability to see God in the creation. The theology of the cross is to say no to that. It's to say that God is revealed in a way that we would never expect, that we look at the cross and we see a suffering human being, and no one in their right mind would say that that is God. And yet this is what Luther discovers. The revelation of God is different than the type of God we would come to if we were left to ourselves in kind of natural theology. So Luther's focus is to say natural knowledge doesn't lead us to God. It leads us into idolatry. It leads us to build our kind of scholastic towers of Babel, as we could put it. He's also very critical of trying to discover God's being. Remember, Aquinas and the medieval period is so focused on being and participation in the being of God. And Luther wants to move away from that. Revelation is not about seeking God's being. Revelation is about God as God reveals God. God has to speak. God has to tell us who God is. We can't get to God. And so really Luther begins this kind of rejection of philosophy as the beginning of theological thought, and wants to put revelation as the foundation to theology. So the starting point for Luther's theology is God's action. It's very Christocentric, very much the cross and the resurrection, that God is at work and revealing God's self in ways that we would never possibly imagine. And again, it's important to recognize the difference now between the being of God, right? So creation participates in the being of God, or a God who reveals through word, speech, speaks. And again, this is going to be a very important difference between the kind of medieval Roman Catholic understanding of theology and what Luther is doing.